Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football Deal. We are going into the month of March. The recruiting trail is picking up. Spring ball is going to be picking up. This is about that time that I start selling myself on them Michigan Wolverines heading into 2025. And if you were to look at the reasons that Michigan can be a college football playoff caliber team going into 2025, I think there's a lot of evidence that points you in that direction. Now, there are some moving parts. You obviously have a true freshman quarterback coming into this offense, but there's also a lot more that you can point to on this football team that you can find confidence in as well. Want to get into my 5 reasons. Before we do it, as always, just want to say thank you to you guys and to the Michigan fans. It's been a blast. It's going to be a blast covering this team in spring practice. The amount of support that y'all continue to show to the boys has been amazing. Appreciate you guys. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Much more importantly, I know many Michigan fans probably operate the same way I operate. And that is, hey, we're looking at this depth chart, finding reasons to believe. If we don't talk about a few reasons, let it fly in the comments section. Appreciate you guys. Dill, when I look at this Michigan team, I think a lot of the national media members are going to get up there and talk about Bryce Underwood, of which we are going to talk about as well. And at the end of the day is the biggest storyline for Michigan being an elite team in 2025. I want to start with something a little bit more under the radar, a little bit more nitty gritty, and that is returning production and continuity. Go back to 12 months ago when we were talking about this Michigan team. We pointed to individual players that were really good. Mason Graham, Colson Loveland, Kenneth Grant, Will Johnson. We knew we had some studs. We knew we had some spot talent on this roster. But from a continuity standpoint, Michigan went into 2024 128th in the country in returning production, had to replace a brand new coaching staff as well. You saw those growing pains early in the 2024 year. One of the things that I think makes me so confident is, look, there's a lot of continuity from a coaching staff standpoint. They're 29th in the country in returning production. And yeah, you lose some really good football players in Mason Graham, Kenneth Grant, Colson Loveland, but you return the bulk of this team. Whereas 12 months ago, the bulk of this team, the bulk of the guys were playing for Michigan in the national championship year, were going to the NFL.
And I think you look like a lot of Michigan fans, like myself certainly included, was like, oh, yeah, we're losing some really good players. But you look like maybe the best 4 were all coming back. And just like, that's why, like, when you say football is a team sport, it like really is. And you can't have like big cracks in your roster. And like, again, it did take Michigan's offensive line probably too long to kind of really get rolling and start playing better football. And again, not to put it all on them, there was inherently an issue that the quarterback was never going to be close to being good enough to run an offense effectively, whether your offensive line was good or bad. But I still think you saw the secondary take a little longer than maybe we would have wanted to gel and stop making
mistakes. Dill, I think one of the things, and I was listening to a Wink Martindale interview, and he said, hey, there were some growing pains with me as a defensive play caller, spending the last 20 years at the NFL level and then kicking down to college. Like the college offenses it's a little bit of a different game. And there were some growing pains with myself as well running this defense. You don't expect those growing pains in 2025. The last thing I'll note is it kind of goes back to what made Michigan so special in 2023, where there were really good football players on the team. Guys like J.J. McCarthy, guys like Blake Corum, Mason Graham. You could go down the list, but would I continue to this day still believe what made Michigan truly a national championship team in that 2023 year was how complete the roster was and how deep the roster was. And you feel much more confident about how complete this football team is going into the 2025 year than you did in 2024, even if you don't have some of that high-end star talent, the guys like Mason Graham. Number 2, nobody's really going to talk about this, but I think it's a big factor, and that's the run game should be better than it was in 2024. Now, inherently, the run game struggled in 2024 because you didn't really have a passing attack. And so Michigan was just seeing 8, 9-man boxes because defenses were not afraid of Michigan throwing over the top. We just did it. I mean, you take a look at the numbers. I mean, Dill, how many throws do you think traveled 20-plus yards for Davis Warren last year? The answer is 15. That is astonishingly low. And so you look at why to believe in the run game. It probably starts with two really good running backs in Jordan Marshall and Justice Haynes. It starts with an offensive line that has that continuity, and we kind of know Sherrone Moore is going to put out a good offensive line. But then finally, like Bryce Underwood, nobody talks about it because Bryce is so talented with his arm. But this is a different caliber athlete than probably a better athlete than J.J. McCarthy running the football in terms of how fluid he is and his ability to make people miss. The added element of Bryce Underwood, a massive upgrade from a guy like Davis Warren or a guy like Alex Orji last year.
And even it goes a little deeper in just being more athletic than obviously both. And I think even more properly athletic than Alex Orji, but the ability to run an offensive run scheme that does feature a little bit more read options and quick decision making, kind of that are necessary, because that was just something you never felt like Alex Orji was doing.
So bad. Oh my God.
Again, like obviously the issue of not being able to throw the ball effectively makes it hard to run the ball. And when they know that he's in, they're running the ball. But also just that ability, it didn't feel like they were comfortable running him with read options because he didn't make the right decision particularly consistently. No. You like go back to moments of Bryce Underwood's high school career, he really could run like a relatively advanced read option kind of and make those quick decisions and make them correctly consistently enough where, and again, I think you can be even more creative in the rushing attack, whether you have better.
And that's another thing that I don't think Chip Lindsey gets enough credit for. I think when you talk Chip Lindsey, you talk about quarterback development, which is the reason we brought him in Michigan. Dill, I mean, what UNC was doing with Drake May and Amarian Hampton, even what UNC was doing in 2024 when they didn't have Drake May, but they only had Amarian Hampton. Like, this was a UNC team that consistently was able to run the football, go back to his time at Auburn as well. You look at Chip Lindsey, he gets that tag of a quarterback developer, which I think all of us Michigan fans are really excited about because that's what we need. But he can scheme up a good run game too, and he's going to have the pieces to really run the football well. And that to me is a huge storyline. Like there are plenty of question marks about the pass catchers for Michigan in 2025. There's no way for me to get up here and sell everybody that Michigan's going to have an elite pass catcher unit as it sits right now. The best thing you can do for a freshman quarterback, give him a good run game. I do think Michigan has the pieces to do so. Number 3, Chip Lindsey, Bryce Underwood. I mean, this is probably where we should have led it with. But at the end of the day, this is what it's going to come down to. You bring in a new offensive coordinator that I think everybody expects to be significantly better than Kurt Campbell. And then you bring in a guy like Bryce Underwood who allows you to do anything you want on offense. And you look at last year, how limited Michigan was. When Alex Orji was in, you couldn't really throw the football. When Davis Warren was in, you could not move the pocket with him because he just was not a good enough athlete, couldn't throw off platform. You couldn't push the ball down the field because he didn't really have the arm talent to do so. And you couldn't attack the boundaries either because Davis Warren throwing from an opposite hash of the boundary, just the arm wasn't live enough. Now you bring in Bryce Underwood, everything is at your disposal for Chip Lindsey and how he wants this offense to look in the 2025 year.
That's where it gets interesting. Like, what can a Freddie Moore be? Like, you saw him in that Alabama game make the type of play you need from your wide receivers. So, like, I get it. And Michigan's wide receivers certainly deserve, like, their share of criticism for what happened last year. I don't think they were good enough. But I also look, again, when you are that limited at the quarterback spot in Michigan, like, that's about as limited as you could possibly be at, like, the Power 4 level, I think.
Yes.
I am very interested to see what they can get from Freddie Moore, or even, like, where can they use some
and I think
can they get him some more space and let him be a little bit more active? Because, like, last year, the offense was predicated around everything was underneath. Like, it's hard to run bubble screens when teams can kind of just sit on you.
So when teams are playing one safety high, it's hard to get the screen game and quick game going.
You've seen Samaj Morgan make plays with his legs. You've seen him do some good things as a true freshman. Like, I'm interested to see, like, again, like, you're right. It's not going to be an elite wide receiver room. Like, everybody knows that. But, like, is it going to be as bad as probably a lot of Michigan fans think right now? That's probably the question. In an offense, what can those guys kind of do?
That'll be really interesting to monitor in spring practice because I do think there's a part of Sherrone Moore, Sean Maggie, like how we want to build this roster. Let's go into spring practice with significantly better quarterback play and Bryce Underwood, Mikey Keenan, Jaden Davis. Let's get a better feel. Like, Dill, I'm almost not surprised Michigan didn't address the wide receivers in spring ball because if Alex Orji was running with the ones, how are you supposed to evaluate what your wide receivers are? And so now we got better quarterback play. which is going to allow us to better evaluate the pass catchers on this football team. And look, if you come out of spring practice and, all right, well, we still don't think the wide receivers are good enough, I wouldn't be surprised if Michigan makes a big splash, because there's going to be good wide receivers that hit in that spring transfer portal window. And I think a lot of frustration was, well, we brought in Donovan McCulley, we brought in a guy like Anthony Simpson, solid guys, but probably not different.
There were a lot of really good wideouts that I think you look at like, it felt like, at least on the outside looking in, like, why is Michigan making bigger pushes? Because there's some great ones.
We might see maybe it's just, let's see what we have, and then we'll make a push if we need to. Defensive side of the football, I think this is probably the biggest question. I talked about it the other day. Like, I think the defense is being slept on a little bit. And why is it being slept on? Because on the surface, you lose Mason Graham, who is one of, if not the most dominant players in all of college football last year. You lose Kenneth Grant. You lose a guy like Will Johnson, although he didn't even really play when Michigan's defense started turning it up. This is, if there's one thing that I would make the argument of, hey, why can Michigan's defense continue to be elite? It is, you're a deeper football team. Like last year, especially on the inside of the defensive line, early in the season, Mason Graham, Kenneth Grant, Rayshon Benny. But outside of that, like Trey Pierce hadn't really come on yet. Enoetta certainly didn't really come on yet. You look in the secondary, you certainly have some question marks about some of your starters in the back end. I look at this depth chart and say, yeah, there's no Mason Graham on it. But like you said at the top of the episode, football is, it's an 11 players on the football field, and you cannot have holes on defense. And I feel like, although the top end talent is moving on to the NFL, you feel like a deeper and more complete defense than you were in the 2024 season.
Because honestly, for like the first 6 games until Trey Pierce, that felt like they were comfortable enough to get him on the field. And eventually they did, and he was playing pretty good football.
Yes.
But for the first 6 weeks, it was pretty much a 3-man rotation of Benny, obviously, and Kenny and Mason. Like, that was,
Mason was playing like 65 snaps a game.
Kenny played insane amounts of football. And again, those two guys were, frankly, they were good enough where, like, yes, even them at like 80% was really good. There's not that many players in the college football world that can kind of do that. They kind of made it work, obviously, and they were the only reason Michigan was in a lot of football games. But I do think being able to roll probably 6 deep, especially with Enoetta starting to play better. Ike, it sounded like, obviously, Wink Martindale, if you listen to In the Trenches podcast, big fan of Ike. So it's like they can now go 6 deep. I think they can keep guys fresher. Like, will some of the parts be? Again, I don't think it's not going to be a better unit.
Well, here's this. Here's what I don't want to ignore, though, is that I do still think you have some legitimate star talent on this football team going into 2025. It might not be a known commodity like Mason Graham, but if you told me Derek Moore, TJ Guy lead the Big Ten in sacks, wouldn't be all that surprised. No. Jayshon Barr and Ernest Hausman are 2 NFL guys that probably should be playing on Sundays if NIL and kind of play that type of player retention wasn't a thing. Then you look in the back end. I mean, like Zeke Berry played very good football down the stretch. You get a guy like Rod Moore back who is significantly better. A healthy Rod Moore is way better than whatever safety Michigan was playing with last year. There are some guys that are legit NFL dudes on this team as well. And so I look at it, and here's the last conversation here, Dale. The schedule, it shapes up pretty good for Michigan. And this, I think, is the first time we've looked at the Michigan schedule in this offseason. You have you look at the Big Ten schedule. You don't play Oregon, you don't play Penn State. That's big because you look at the top 4 teams in the Big Ten. It's probably Michigan, Ohio State, Penn State, and Oregon. You missed 2 out of the top 3 teams. You also missed that 4th team in Illinois that is going to be sneaky good. And then you get Ohio State at home. But then you start looking at the schedule and say, all right, you go on the road to Norman, Oklahoma with what we think is going to be a freshman quarterback. That is certainly a game where our antennas are up. But I look at that matchup, Dale, and say,
will they be able to block?
Can Oklahoma block Michigan's defense up? I don't know if they can. Michigan's certainly on defense going to stay in that football game. Then you go on the road to Lincoln, Nebraska, late in September. I still think, especially with Nebraska, I feel like you talk about Dylan Rolla, but they got a lot of question marks on the offensive line and in the front 7. And you scroll down and say there's not a ton of these games where you are really nervous about. You go on the road across the country to USC, and then you get Ohio State at home. Like, do I look at the schedule and say 10-2 seems very likely, maybe 9-3. And 9-3, 10-2 is going to get you in that conversation. I don't think it's crazy that, yes, this Michigan team was not very good in 2024. You're looking at, in my opinion, a playoff team on paper, but you also get that schedule that backs it up too. We will pause it there. A lot more to talk about going into spring practice. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll talk to y'all later. Peace.